So, why does all of this matter? Right? Because you might say, okay, you've tortured us for 2 weeks, why? Okay? Here's why it matters. Because underlying all of this, underlying all of the discussion that we've had, is a theory of universal grammar. And we mentioned this before. And that is this idea that the capacity to learn a language is encoded in the DNA of people, of human beings. Unlike in the DNA of dogs or birds or even monkeys or chimps or whatever you have. And so this universal capacity to learn a language is called universal grammar, UG for short. Okay? So, more specifically, universal grammar is a set of parameters, which I told you can think of as switches, there is on or off, that once you combine them all together, they give you all possible languages, human languages. Okay? And by the way, well, whenever we talk about this, you always have to distinguish between natural languages and invented languages. Okay? And the two are different. So you have languages like, for example, Esperanto, which was invented by a guy, his name was Zamenhof. He was a doctor. And he said, well, it'd be nice if we could all communicate. So he came up with a language that was supposed to be universal. And actually, there's lots of people that have learned it and speak it. And, it's not that difficult. There's been hundreds of universal languages, none of which has ever succeeded as a universal language, because in principle, we can't really do that. Okay? But my point is that universal languages like this that are invented are different from natural languages, okay? And they're different in the fact that they're simpler. Otherwise, why bother inventing a universal language, okay? And so computer languages, for example, are also completely different from natural language. They're far simpler than natural languages, okay? So, we're talking here about possible natural languages as spoken by human beings. Okay, so the idea then is that children use the input that they hear from, their parents speaking, the caregivers that are around them, whatever you, and they use this input to switch the parameters on and off. Okay, so if I am in Spain and I hear people saying things like llueve, which is it rains, but there is no it, it's just rains. Then I say, aha, I don't need a subject in my sentences. Whereas if I am in England and I hear people say it rains and never rains, I say, aha, I need to have a subject in my sentences. Otherwise, people will think I'm funny. Okay? And so then the child sets the parameter pro drop to yes, drop the subject, or no, don't drop the subject. Okay? So that's how children learn languages, is by setting parameters, but the parameters themselves are universal. That is, every language needs to make a decision. Am I going to allow dropping the pronoun in a sentence like it rains or not? Okay? So that's why it's universal. Then the parameter is set according to the given language that the child is learning. Okay? So another parameter would be, where do you put the head of a phrase? Okay? If you remember, we talked about this. You have a sentence like a prepositional phrase. The head is the preposition, right? A noun phrase, the head is the noun. The verb phrase, the head is the verb. So where do you put the head of the phrase? Well, in English, you put it at the beginning. Okay? So we say, I went to the store. To is the preposition of the prepositional phrase, to the store, right? Okay? I went with my friends. With is the preposition of the prepositional phrase, with my friends, right? So with comes first, okay? Now, in Hungarian, It's the other way around. You put the preposition at the end of the noun phrase, and in fact, it's attached to the word at the end. It's not even on its own. It's a bound morpheme that attaches to the morpheme at the end. Okay? But it comes at the end of the prepositional phrase. So again, how do you set this parameter? Well, you're a child, you're learning the language, and you say, oh, wait, I keep hearing the preposition at the end, therefore, must be that it's at the end of the prepositional phrase. Right? Of course, you're not thinking in terms of preposition and prepositional phrases, you're just learning that in order to be correct, your sentence has to come out a certain way. Okay? So the parameters are part of universal grammar. And then you might ask, well, what else is in universal grammar? Well, actually plenty of stuff. The problem is that it's very, very technical, so it's difficult to explain without going into a lot of painful detail. So I can only give you a general idea. One is, well, recursion. We just talked about it, you know. So the idea that you can have something that has within it another instance of itself and then keep looping, that's apparently universal, okay? We mentioned last time, well, there is the whole discussion about Piranha that apparently does not allow recursion, and Everett says that that's the case, and then people disagree, okay? So that's an open question.
So, like computer science recursion, does recursion in language need a control to stop it?
No, because in language we have something called the speaker dies. So you cannot keep embedding because at some point you're going to stop. Because if you don't stop, you will die. You know, so it's a very simple escape mechanism. It's a built-in escape mechanism. Sooner or later, the speaker has to go eat, or you know, falls over from exhaustion, right? So I don't know what's the longest case of recursion ever recorded, but eventually the speaker runs out of energy or breath and just gives up and stops speaking, right? So you don't have to have a built-in escape clause because it's like it's already there. Eventually you will stop adding prepositional phrases and you'll run out of breath, if nothing else. The other thing that's in universal grammar that I can give you as an example is a very sort of abstract and somewhat sophisticated idea. And again, let's go look at my little tree here. So look at the noun phrase and the verb phrase. Together, they form the sentence, right? Now look at the verb and the noun phrase under the VP. Together, the verb and the noun phrase form the verb phrase. What does it mean that together they form?
They're both necessary.
They're both necessary, yes, that's very good. But that's not exactly what I'm looking for. That is, yes, they're necessary, but what happens when they form the verb phrase? When you take, for example, water and, for example, vinegar and oil, you pour them together and you shake them with a fork, for example, to create a vinaigrette, a salad dressing, okay? So what has happened is you have created an emulsion, okay? What it means is that you've reduced the oil and the vinegar to very thin droplets so that you can no longer see them as separate, right? If you take a puddle of oil and you pour some vinegar in it, you can tell the difference between the two. But when you do the emulsion, by agitating violently the two liquids, they become teeny tiny droplets, and you can no longer see the difference, and what you get is your salad dressing. And by the way, then you said that you don't learn anything practical in this class. Add a little salt and pepper, pour on top of your salad, you're good to go. So in this sense, what happens when I take a verb and a noun phrase and put them together? Well, what happens is merging, okay? And it's almost, it sounds kind of mystical, but what you get is they become a different thing, okay? That is, you have a verb and you have a noun phrase, you put them together, and what you get is a verb phrase. And it's no longer just the verb and the noun phrase, it's a constituent of its own, okay? And this is what Chomsky calls merge, okay? You know, and so this is this idea that by putting together two constituents, you get a different constituent that's different from the two. It's not just a verb and a noun phrase. It's now a verb phrase, okay? And it forms a different category, okay? So that's what merge does. It takes two constituents and turns them into a third one, okay? And so again, it's a very abstract concept, which has been investigated in other forms. The general theory of this is called application, and it's really complicated, and so you don't want to go there. But I'm just saying it's a whole field in logic that I've actually done some reading in. It's just like fun. But when you talk about this stuff, people sort of gently walk off and leave you alone at parties. So don't do that. Yes.
Are we still discovering like components of universal grammar, or have the?
Good question. So are we still discovering components of universal grammar? Well, it depends who you ask. In this sense, that lots of people are saying this whole idea of universal grammar has been discredited. Okay? There is no such thing as universal grammar. Chomsky was wrong. He took linguistics in the wrong direction. Forget Chomsky. We're doing our own thing now, and things are better. Okay, we're going to talk about this in a second. Then there is other people who are still saying, oh, no. Chomsky was absolutely right, and you know, we are finding new things, and you know, we are refining the ideas, and so on and so forth. And the two parties don't talk to each other. Okay, so from that perspective, you know, if you'd asked me this in the 1990s, I would have said yes, and the Chomskyans are winning. Today, no, the Chomskyans are losing. Okay, that is, it's linguistics has kind of moved on. However, and this is crucial, you need to understand the stuff that I've been telling you, because a lot, in fact, most of the research that today is used was done under the umbrella of Chomskyan syntax. So you can't understand contemporary linguistics, which is what, if you read an article published in a journal nowadays, most of it comes from people who were trained along these lines or refers to ideas that belong to this paradigm. Okay? So you need to understand it, even though some of the courses that you're going to take in the master's or the PhD, the teacher is going to say, forget Chomsky, that's nonsense, doesn't matter, etc. Yeah, and that's probably true. The field has moved on, okay? But in a ways, it's moved on even just by rejecting Chomsky's idea, as, for example, the cognitive linguists do. They say, we don't want any part of Chomsky, we're doing our own thing. But it's the opposite of what Chomsky said. So you're still reacting to Chomsky in a way, okay? So it's important to understand this stuff in order to be able to follow what's going on in linguistics nowadays, okay? And this provides a nice transition to my next slide. So, again, why should we care? What's at stake? You know, you could say, hey, I lived a perfectly good life until now without knowing any of this, right? Why should I care? And by the way, this question you should always ask when you're taking a class in college, in university, in the master's, in a PhD. Why should I care about this? Jason, is that a question?
Yes. So with universal grammar, considering that, like, you know, many different languages, they kind of like use grammar differently, or they have
Yeah.
word order that's different. And to
Yeah.
them, in their language, the word order, for instance, like we say, I eat lollipops, and some people might say lollipops, it eats, but to them it makes sense, to us it makes sense. How can universal grammar transcend that? Because it's even, I've been trying to think about
Right.
it, but it's
Well,
still a bit confusing.
sure. Let's go back to this. That's the idea of the parameter. Okay? So universal grammar, it's like a light switch, right? A parameter is like a light switch. You can have the lights on or the lights off, right? So you can say in some forms you're in the dark, right? You have the lights off. Or you can be in the light, right? So they're completely different ways of being. You can either have the lights on or the lights off. But the switch is the same, right? So even though the outcome is radically different, the switch, the decision is the same. You either have the lights on or you have the lights off. So, you know, using the example of the zero subject, in English, you cannot say, today rains. Right? It doesn't work. But in Spanish, you can say it. In Italian, you can say it. You can say, oggi piove. Perfectly fine sentence of English. In French, you cannot say, aujourd'hui pleut. It doesn't work. You have to say, aujourd'hui il pleut. Right? Just like in English, you have to say, today it rains. Right? So the difference is the parameter. It's either on, you have to have the it, or it's off. You don't have to have the it. The universal part is the parameter, is the choice. Does that work? Okay. All right. So again, why should we care about this? Right? So for example, why should we care about parameters? I mean, after all, you know, you might say, I've lived a perfectly good, fulfilling life, or somewhat fulfilling, whatever. I don't know. Are you fulfilled? Yes. Okay. So a fulfilling life up to now without knowing about parameters. What's it doing for me? Right? You know, you might say, what's it doing for me? Why should I know about this? Well, here's why. Because what's really at stake is a theory of how people acquire language. Okay? And now we're talking concrete, actual consequences, because it's not just about children. And no, we could talk for decades about the potential problems if children you know, are not allowed to learn language naturally, but also how adults learn language, and that's second language acquisition, right? So here I'm talking about first language acquisition, but I could have had a slide about second language acquisition, all right? And now you know why it matters, right? Because in a TESOL program or an applied linguistics program, what are you doing? You're teaching adults English, right? Well, that's it, right? So it's directly relevant, right? So in other words, the reason that you need to know this stuff is not just because I tell you so, although there would be plenty reason, let me tell you. No, I'm kidding. The reason you need to know this stuff is because it underlies the theory of how people acquire language, which underlies the theory of how people teach language, logically. Okay? So if you don't know how language works, you can't teach it, quite simply. Okay? All right. So how do people learn their first language? Okay? Now, this is not language acquisition class, right? So this is going to be the very short version of it. But there are three basic theories. The first one, which was proposed by a group of psychologists called behaviorists, is the idea that you learn by imitation. Okay? So in other words, you hear somebody say something, you try to imitate, you try to repeat what they said. At first, you may not succeed very well, but after a little bit of practice, you succeed. And so you learn by imitation. This is how you can train a chicken to play tic-tac-toe by pecking the grain. You put the grain, then the chicken pecks where you want. After a while, you remove the grain, and the chicken still tries that. Pavlov's dog, right? You ring a bell, you feed the dog. After a while, you just ring the bell, the dog starts to salivate because they've associated the idea of the bell ringing with the food being there, right? So basically, you condition the person, the animal, whatever. So basically, Skinner behaviorists say, training a horse and teaching a child how to speak are the same thing. You just instill a habit through imitation, okay? So that was the idea. And by the way, in language pedagogy, that's when you have the idea of drilling, okay? That's how they taught me English. I'm that old. I'm totally serious. We sat in class and the teacher would go, okay, everybody repeat after me. The boy loves the girl. And we would go, the boy loves the girl. Again, the boy loves the girl. All right, the boy loved the girl. The boy loved the girl. It was a lot of fun. No, it was not. It was horrible. And then when I went to high school, finally they had a record player. And so we repeated after the record. That was a major breakthrough in pedagogy. I'm not joking. I'm telling you these true stories of my life. We used stone tablets to write. But we didn't have iPhones, believe it or not. I know it's hard to believe. So then Chomsky comes along, and Chomsky, and by the way, this is a very interesting thing. If you want to read a vicious review, Skinner wrote a book in which he said, this is how children learn language. Chomsky wrote a review of Skinner's book in which he literally destroys it. And just like takes it apart and says, this is complete and utter nonsense, okay? And Skinner never even understood what hit him with that. But it was one of the things that made Chomsky's reputation as a linguist. So Chomsky says, well, first of all, language is genetically encoded. You have this universal grammar genetically in there. And there's all sorts of arguments in favor of this. For example, look at me speaking English right now, right? So from a lexical standpoint, without any false modesty, I'm probably better than most native speakers. I know more words than most native speakers, okay? I mean, I think there's, anybody wants to challenge me? Any native speaker? Any native speaker? No, all right. No, but Jason is pretending like he's not there at all. It's like, me? No habla español. It's like, I don't even know what that means, but okay. So yeah, in terms of word lexical choices, I'm there with the native speakers. Syntax, have you heard me make any syntactic mistakes when I was speaking today? No. Morphology, I'm there. Phonology, oops, right? I mean, Jason, you can speak freely. I'm not going to give you an F in the class. Can you tell that I'm not a native speaker?
Yeah, but
yeah, that's the answer. Don't worry. How dare you? I will flunk you now. No. Of course you can hear it, right? Because you can hear you too, right? The first thing, like, absolutely, right? Okay. So that's it, right? I mean, the moment I open my mouth, every native speaker of English says, oh, where are you from? I'm like, you bastards. No, I don't say that. I open my mouth and you know immediately that I'm not a native speaker of English. Why is that? Well, I learned English after the critical period. Okay, that is the idea, Chomsky says, is that you have to learn your native language before roughly the age of 12. Okay, if you learn it too late, you will never sound like a native speaker, or it will be very, very hard to sound like a native speaker. Okay, so even though your morphology may be perfect, your syntax may be perfect, your lexicon may be perfect, your pragmatics may be perfect, but you will not sound like a native speaker because you learned it too late. Okay, now there's all sorts of arguments against this, and we're not going to get into this. There's a whole class that does language acquisition. Leave me alone. My point is that's the argument, right? That is, the idea is, well, if no matter how much work you put in, you cannot learn your second language like your first, to sound like your first one. That means that there's something biological about it, right? Because if there were not, then just by practicing, I should be able to sound like a native speaker, okay? But in fact, you don't, or at least it takes like really, really hard work to sound like a native speaker, okay? So then this idea of activation of parameters, as we discussed, and then he has a very clever argument, which is known as the poverty of stimulus argument, in which Chomsky says, if you think about it for a second, children, first of all, most children, not my daughter who screamed for the first 2 years of her life, but most children actually sleep most of the time when they're little. Okay, and that's true. Children, when they're little, will sleep up to 50% of the time. So while they're sleeping, they're obviously not learning language, right? And then, when they're screaming at the top of their lungs, they're not learning language because they would be covering any language that you're producing at them with their screaming. So they don't have a lot of time to be learning language, right? So if they had to learn it from scratch, it would be extremely difficult. Because on top of it, children don't get a lot of input, okay? Because most of the time, what do they get? Somebody that goes goo, 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 right? Or goo, goo, So it's not really good language input, right? So Chomsky says there is not enough time in a child's life to learn a full-blown language in a couple of years, right? Because basically by age 2, they're already speaking. By age 5, they're producing perfectly good sentences, and by age 12, they're done, okay? So Chomsky says there has to be an innate component because children couldn't figure it out from scratch because there just isn't enough time to learn the lexicon, learn the grammar, learn the phonology, the morphology, all of that, unless a lot of it is already given to you genetically. So for a good 20 years, people were very sort of convinced by this. But then the tables turned, and a new group of people started looking at this, and slowly they started chipping away at this whole idea, the whole Chomskyan approach to language acquisition. First of all, by doing studies, they showed, for example, that in fact, this idea of the critical period isn't quite true. People keep learning throughout their lives, okay? What is really happening for a speaker like me is called fossilization, which means you become a fossil as me. No, sorry, that's not it at all. What it means is that you stop learning because you're comfortable, okay? Right now, you understand me. What incentive do I have to sound like I'm from Texas? Y'all, right? What incentive do I have? Absolutely nothing, right? Everybody understands me. When I go to the store, they give me what I want, right? I have to pay, but you get the concept, right? It's not that I ask for one thing and they give me something else. Then I would have an incentive to improve. But I have no incentive left to improve, right? Therefore, I stop and I produce my sounds the way I want because, well, it's easier, okay? But if I had an incentive to improve, I could achieve native-like proficiency. There's cases that are documented of this happening. There's, in fact, a whole field of study about sort of overachievers in language. People who become like totally proficient, like native speakers, at least in some area. So first of all, this idea of the critical period is kind of rejected. Then the other thing, people said the idea of the poverty of stimulus is bunk. Because in fact, it turns out there is such a thing as child-directed speech, which is, the variety of language that people use when they're talking to children. And it turns out that they don't just say goo, 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 although they say that as well. But then when you speak to children, for example, you use an exaggerated prosody so that you will say things like, who's daddy's girl, right? You know, when you're talking to my daughter, I would say, who's daddy's girl? Right? By doing this, you're emphasizing the parts of the sentence that are more important. You're repeating things a lot. You're doing things like feedback, where you say, you know, the child says, I go to school. And you say, oh, you went to school, right? Where you correct without saying, no, that's wrong. You know, but you demonstrate what's the proper way of saying things, right? And so there is this whole idea that, you know, not just the parents or the caregivers, but everybody who interacts with children, you know, crafts their language in a way, in such a way that it makes it particularly accessible for the child. But also, and this is the most interesting thing, that children learn best in a social environment, okay? And this is an observation that those of you who've had more than one child will immediately understand, is the second child learns language faster than the first one because they have their older sibling to talk to, right? And so they will acquire language much faster because they've got somebody to talk to that's their peer, okay? And so this is the kind of thing. So you know, when you put your kid in daycare, actually you're doing something fantastic from the point of view of language acquisition, because they're going to have to talk to their peers, and that's when they learn much faster and more effectively. Okay, so the whole idea that, I mean, and of course, you know, you also learn from your talking to your mother, your father, the caregivers, etc. But the idea is that acquisition is done socially. Okay, and in fact, there's been, and these are not real experiments because you can't do this kind of experiment, but there've been feral children, that are children that are abandoned or whatever, and they grow up without a regular environment. And in some cases, demented parents or whatever, like, have done things where they kept their child in a shed, for example, with a TV set on, right? But the children never learn the language, because you don't learn the language just by listening to it. You have to interact with it. So just hearing the language isn't going to do it for you. You need to talk to somebody. You need to have responses from somebody to acquire the language, okay? So the whole idea of interactionist language learning is that you learn language by interacting with people, okay? And that is the winning field, okay? That is, in all likelihood, that is the correct theory of language acquisition, okay? So now I'm simplifying horribly. I'm sure that, you know, when you take a language acquisition class, you'll be like, for God's sake, I was really simplifying that. But in a nutshell, this is the big idea, okay? So again, Chomsky's ideas fit in this, if nothing else, because interactionism is a rejection of Chomsky's ideas. Okay, so this ends my review of syntax. So now we're going to take a very short break, and then we'll go on to reviewing the sentences so that you can see a little bit more practice for syntax. Okay? All right. Well, that was the short break. Thank you. I didn't say how short. All right. So first of all, generally speaking, in the homework that the comprehension review that I saw, people did quite well. But I saw two kinds of mistakes that recur, and these are sort of generally speaking not unique to these classes. They occur all the time. So the first one is, for some unclear reason, people don't want to remember the idea that if there is a prepositional phrase, it's always followed by a preposition and a noun phrase underneath, okay? So that's compulsory. There are no exceptions, Okay, and the other case that there is no exception is the sentence that has the noun phrase and the verb phrase. That one, everybody got right. The prepositional phrase, people for some reason, they just want to put preposition, article, noun, etc., forgetting the noun phrase in the middle. So,
Especially if there is no article, right? If it's just a noun right after.
yeah, that's fine. But even if there's just a noun, it has to say noun phrase, right? Because there is a constituent there. The other problem, and this is more serious, is prepositional phrase attachment. Okay, that is, where does the prepositional phrase attach? Okay, because the direct object is very easy to identify. Where else could it attach? To the verb, right? To the verb phrase. There's no other option, right? But the prepositional phrase, you have options, and then sometimes it becomes a problem, okay? So that's why we're going to look now to the sentences that were on CR5, so that we can see from the examples, you know, and I'm going to discuss some of the examples, we can see what the options could have been and why these are correct, okay? Okay, so, and by the way, this is a student work, okay? So that you know that it was feasible, okay? All right, so here the sentence was, the boy with red hair loves cherries from the tree in his yard, okay? So the boy here, the noun phrase of this, the direct object, no problem there. Then with red hair, again, this was fairly easy to identify because what else could it modify? It's the boy that has the red hair, right? So it's fairly straightforward, and you can never, under any circumstances, have the prepositional phrase modified yes. That doesn't exist, right? So this one was clear. There were no problems there. Okay, so then the verb phrase, that's easy also, right? Because it has to be there. The verb loves, again, no problem, that's easy. Then you have the direct object, loves the cherries, no problem, right? This is also easy. And then you have from the tree, right? Now, from the tree could modify two things, the cherries or the loving, right? Because theoretically, you could have gone up here, right? However, it doesn't make sense. Okay, that is, what would it mean to say that the loving is from the tree? The boy is on top of the tree and says, from here, I love the cherries. That doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, it's absurd. It just doesn't make sense. Hence, this interpretation is discarded. You can't do that, okay? So from the tree tells you where the cherries come from, right? So that's the correct, the from the tree modifies the noun phrase, the cherries. Okay? So then it says, in his yard. And again, this could modify the tree, as we have it here, right? It could modify the cherries. Now, this could potentially, possibly make sense. That is, you could have two balls of cherries, one that was picked in the yard and one that was bought from the store. The boy loves the one from the yard and doesn't like the one from the store. Okay, theoretically, I guess if you really, really pushed me, you could say that that was a possible thing. Definitely could not be that the loving is done from the yard. I mean, what? Is he standing in the yard and saying, from here, I love the cherries, elsewhere I don't? That makes no sense, right? But again, theoretically, the prepositional in the yard, the prepositional phrase could modify this or could modify this, right? So there's 2 and 3 possibilities, right? And the correct one was 3, which is it modifies, oh, sorry, my bad. It modifies the noun phrase, the tree. The tree is in the yard, right? That's the logical one, okay? So what have we learned from this? That, well, first of all, that cherries are more complicated than you thought. No, okay. So what have we learned from this? That the place where you attach the prepositional phrases has to be the logical one, has to be the one that's meaningful, okay? Now, you may say, well, wait, you said that syntax doesn't have access to semantics. That's a different story. Okay, don't worry about that. Okay, so you have to think, when I am drawing my tree, what's the most obvious, the most logical interpretation, right? And when you have several prepositional phrases like this, there might be 3, even 4, even 5 possibilities of attachment. And you need to decide which one is the right one. You cannot just attach it to the closest thing to the left. That doesn't work that way. Okay? All right, so let's look at the next sentence. So this was, Mary ate a sandwich with lettuce with French fries. Okay? Now, you might say, this is twisted. I agree. Who puts lettuce on a sandwich? Oh, no, okay, well, that's me. I don't like lettuce. All right, so Mary, that's easy. That's the noun phrase. And by the way, that's the example, Sandy, that you were asking me before. Here you have just a noun, but it is a noun phrase nonetheless, right? How do we know that? Well, because under S, you must have a noun phrase, right? So it's a constituent. Ate is the verb of the verb phrase, okay? So no questions there. And then you have a sandwich. That's the direct object. Again, no problem. Obviously modifies the verb phrase, right? That's where it belongs. Then you have with lettuce, and clearly, is it the eating that takes place with lettuce? John ate dinner with lettuce, and his friends? No, that doesn't make sense, right? You don't eat with a leaf of lettuce sitting across from you, right? It's the sandwich that has the lettuce, right? That's what it is, right? So then, correctly, the prepositional phrase with lettuce modifies sandwich, right? All right. And then you have with French fries. Now, this, I admit, was twisted, okay? Because the sandwich isn't with the French fries. It's the eating that takes place with French fries. Okay, so you're eating a sandwich and the eating has the French fries. You don't have the French fries on the sandwich. Now, actually, I have seen people do that. Okay, but that is wrong. Okay, wrongity, wrong. Okay, so if you've learned something from this class, is don't put your French fries in the sandwich. They don't belong there. They belong on the plate with ketchup. That's a different story. All right. So then with the French fries, I had to modify the verb phrase eat. Okay? All right. So then we move on to the third sentence, which was the moon shines on the field at night. Okay? So again, the moon is the subject of the verb of the I'm apparently a bit tired. The moon is the subject, the noun phrase of S, so no problems there. Shines is the verb, so again, no problems there. And then you don't have a direct object here, right? So on the field is a prepositional phrase that modifies the only thing it can modify, the verb phrase, so no problem, right? And then you have at night. Now here you have two options. One is the one that we see here, which is that the shining takes place at night. And then the other one would have been that the field is at night. Okay, which one makes sense? The shining at night. The fields at night makes no sense. Okay, so therefore, one was correct and this one is wrong. Okay, all right. Moving on to number 4. This one was twisted. I fully admit. But lots of people did it right, so good for you. All right, so the girl is your subject, which is then modified by in a red dress. That was fairly straightforward because in the red dress can only modify the girl, right? So that was pretty obvious. But then you had with ribbons. Now, with ribbons could modify the red dress, as we see here, but it could also have modified the girl, right? Now, which is more likely to have ribbons? The red dress or the girl? The red dress, right? Because you don't say the girl with ribbons. You would have to specify in her hair or something like that, Girls don't come with ribbons, dresses do. Okay, I mean, trust me on this one. And then you say you don't learn anything useful in this class. If you didn't know, now you know. Danced, the verb of the verb phrase. So again, that's no problem. The waltz, again, direct object, you dance the waltz, right? Clear, modified verb phrase. And then you had with a smile. Okay, now, again, you have two options. One is the dancing that's done with a smile, or is the waltz that has a smile. Okay, now, I'm not a music major. If there are any music majors, that were music majors in a previous life, I don't think that there is a waltz with a smile. There might be, okay, but that's my point is waltzes don't have smiles. Okay, so it was the dancing that was with a smile. So 1 is correct and 2 is incorrect. Okay, and then on her lips, now this could be the smile, as it is here, right? Or it could be the dancing, right? Now, oh, sorry. The dancing. Obviously, the dancing is not taking place on her lips, it's the smile, right? So then what you have here is correct. On her lips modifies the smile. Okay? All right, and this brings us to our last sentence. Whoops, sorry, my bad. All right, so here you have the owner of the farm, and again, the owner is the subject of the farm modifies the owner. It couldn't modify anything else. And by the way, notice that you never, ever have something like this. Okay? Why can't you do that? Okay, because then VP would rewrite as prepositional phrase, verb, and noun phrase. But we can't do that. Remember, because the verb is the head of the verb phrase. So the leftmost thing in the verb phrase has to be the verb. Right? That's why it's called the head of the phrase. Okay? So you cannot do this ever. Okay? All right. So then we have the owner of the farm, surveyed, is the verb of the verb phrase. The grounds, the direct object, obviously has to attach to the verb phrase. And then you have on horseback. Okay? And again, here you have two options. One, that's the one that we see here, where on horseback modifies the verb phrase. The surveying is done on horseback, right? That makes sense. Could it have been that the grounds were on horseback? No, that makes absolutely no sense at all. Okay, grounds don't fit on a horse, right? So it's impossible. Okay, all right. So that's it. Those were the five sentences. So my point here was very simple. When you're doing your tree diagrams, okay, be careful about where you attach your prepositional phrases, okay? Because you cannot just attach them randomly. You have to stop and think about it and say, what are my options and where do I attach them so that it makes sense? Okay? And that is crucial because if you get that wrong, then you get the sentence wrong. Okay? All right. Any questions? All right, very good. Then this ends our lecture for today. CR6 will be available tomorrow as soon as this lecture is uploaded as well. And then there will be a break. I don't think we have CR7 for a couple of weeks. I forget, but we will send an email reminding everybody when CR7 is in.
Yeah,
All right.
2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.